Perfect. Should be gone.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Noah, for the introduction. I'm going to be talking mainly about the paper he mentioned, which I wrote collaboration with my PhD advisor, David Schneider, and our collaborators at the University of Vienna and the AGH University in Krakow, Poland, Bernard Grossman and Iwona Klinowska. So just to make sure I don't lose anybody in the esoteric nomenclature of Greece, I'll give some background. So the Hellenides in Greece are a segment of the Alpine origin, and this was caused by the prolonged convergence between Africa and Europe since about the mid-Jurassic. And so we had the Tethys Ocean close progressively throughout the Jurassic to now, leaving what is now the Mediterranean Ocean, or Mediterranean Sea, sorry. You can see Greece is marked by this checkerboard box here, and this progressed with prolonged subduction and orogeny that has been active since the early Cretaceous. And this is a not realistic diagram. None of these ocean segments in green ever existed at the same time. Some of them were opening as others were closing. And these different ocean segments of the Tethys were separated by these different microcontinental strands. And so these accreted progressively to the southern margin of Europe via north-directed subduction as those oceans closed, and we got this repetition of different high-pressure metamorphic episodes along with collision of the microcontinents, as well as sporadic ophiolite abduction as each of those oceans closed. And what this led to is a picture like you see here, where things have rotated a bit, so we're now younging in a southward direction instead of younging south because of some block rotations. And essentially each of these belts that you see here is a unit of shared paleogeographic affinity, as I'm sure anybody who's worked in the North American Cordillera or the Appalachians is quite familiar with a configuration like this. And as far as what we're interested in understanding is mainly the discontinuities in these paleogeographic belts. So this pink unit here called the Pelagonian zone is one of those microcontinental blocks, but you can see here this exposure of these, which is the main archipelago that I'm working in. This exposes these two blue units, which are called the cycladic blue schist unit. It's this high pressure, low temperature metamorphic rocks that were derived from this darker green unit that is seen outboard of the Pelagonian unit. So these are exposed not in a true tectonic window because it's not a single continuous structure that bounds their exposure, but they are nonetheless exposed along strike of a different overlying tectonic zone. And we have similar windows up further north here. This green is the same green here. Those are windows, same shared affinity as the cycladic blue schist unit. And we have windows to even deeper structural levels, both in continental Greece and in the Cyclades, which are marked by these beige colored exposures here, marked with the numbered bubbles. And this is what is known as the basal unit, and that correlates to an even further outboard paleogeographic unit called the Gavrovo-Tripolitsa unit. And essentially, these are exposed even below these dark green, or the units of dark green affiliation here, the cycladic blue schist unit, and these Pindos exposures up here. So what we want to understand is what processes were active to get these rocks back to the surface so that we can now go touch them and study them. And what are the controls that give us these sporadic exposures of even deeper structural levels throughout the Cyclades? Because we know these rocks had to have undergone exhumation because they're back at the surface, but there seems to be sporadically differential degrees of exhumation. So, and I swear this is the second to last zoom in on a map for the rest of the talk. To give a brief overview of the geodynamic history of the blue schist, or the cycladic blue schist unit, it's both of these units again in blue here, and they're interpreted to have undergone peak high pressure metamorphism blue schist necladite facies at around 50 million years ago, and they've been interpreted to have undergone exhumation since about 37 million years ago. By contrast, the basal unit, which is shown in these sparse exposures on this island Evia, where I'm working, as well as on the Northeast Attic Peninsula and Samos, as well as a few that are too small to show. This was likewise subducted below the CBU, Cyclades blue schist unit, and that has had different timings proposed for its peak high pressure metamorphism between 35 and 23 million years ago. So there's a lot more open to explore with regards to the basal unit. Obviously, it's not quite as well exposed, so this is understandable. But what would be surprising about its having undergone peak high pressure metamorphism at 23 is that we have good geological evidence that the entire region has begun to undergo extension by 23 million years ago because of slab retreat, causing the formation of a back arc basin, which we have well constrained by some sedimentary evidence in the form of super detachment basins that are dated to about the early Miocene. So in regards to the CBU, since it is much better studied and we know a lot more about its exhumation history, initially it's thought to have undergone exhumation via an extrusion wedge, which is sort of it creeps back up the subduction channel. Fragments of the upper plate, or sorry, the lower plate get attached to the upper plate and progressively work their way back up. This is shown in the upper diagram here, and this is thought to accommodate the bulk of the magnitude of exhumation that we see in the Cyclades, probably accommodated between 30 and 50 kilometers worth of exhumation. And then later, since the early Miocene, we have these major low angle detachment systems, the North Cycladic detachment system and the West Cycladic detachment system, that have kind of come in and dissected the crust. These accommodated mainly the later increments of exhumation, but as you can see in comparing the bottom diagram to the top diagram, this seems to have imposed a much more profound degree of geometrical modification to the crust. And so the distribution of the different units in the Cyclades might be more controlled by these low angle normal faults than by the mechanism that yielded the majority of the exhumation. So finally, coming to the island that I'm working on, Evia is at the northwestern corner of the Cyclades, and it has the most extensive exposure of that lower structural level basal unit that was under thrust the CBU sometime between 35 and 23 million years ago. And because of the apparently convergent nature of this tectonic contact, most of the previous work on Evia is focused on looking at it from that convergent tectonic lens. So trying to understand the processes of nap stacking by looking at this contact. Unfortunately, it's fairly poorly exposed, and direct descriptions of the thrust are lacking. So it's more of an inferred boundary than anything, supported by fossil evidence that these are two different units exposed on the island. However, because we can actually touch these things, again, we know that the rocks here must record exhumation, and there's no reason to think that they were exhumed by processes that differ significantly from those that operated regionally. We can see the North Cycladic detachment system has been interpreted to continue here from off the map, which means that we're in the footwall, and that likely contributed to its exhumation. So the hypothesis we came here to test is that there is some sort of structural and geochronological signature of this exhumation recorded on Evia. So in the paper, we differentiate two different zones. One is primarily occupied by the marble, which we call the lower zone, and then one is kind of between the marble and the upper contact with the Cycladic blue schist unit called the upper zone. So I'm going to talk about the structures we see in each of these for the next portion of the talk. And the lower zone, which comprises the marbles and most of the internal portion of the tectonic window, has previously been interpreted as a major antiform that was controlled by an top to the east thrust fault called the Elmira-Podemos thrust. And previous work hypothesized that this was the dominant control, imbricating the entirety of the basal unit and controlling the majority of its internal structure. So we visited these outcrops, and what we saw was maybe not in direct agreement with that. So we saw two fold generations, one of which has east to west to northeast southwest trending fold axes, parallel to the northeast southwest stretching lineation, very common for folding related to subduction. The folds are isoclinal, and they have gently dipping axial planes that are parallel to the hosting foliation. The second generation of folds have north-south axial trends, so perpendicular to the first generation. They're tight to isoclinal, and they show gently to moderately west-dipping axial planes. You can see this shown in the field photos here. You have an axial plane cleavage, penetrative, that is overprinting this foliation, and the angle between them suggests we're probably coming up to the hinge in the upper limb of this overturned fold. And similarly, you can see the more gently dipping examples of the folds here. Just another couple of pictures showing that development of the axial plane cleavage over the metamorphic foliation and the interfolding between the metaconglomeratic lenses and the more dominant, more voluminous marbles in the basal unit. So if we put these observations together, the perpendicular fold axes and the perpendicular axial planes would predict that we would get a type 2 fold interference pattern. And fortunately, we saw a cut that confirmed this because it showed these mushroom interference patterns. So that's the actual hinge of that first generation of east trending folds poking through the later east vergent folding, which confirmed the more broad observations of the two fold generations. And this, based on the geometry expected for a type 2 fold, might help to explain why the metaconglomeratic lenses kind of hook off to the left, and that might be a result of the broader interfolding superimposed fold generations that we see on a smaller scale in the outcrops. Across all of the fold limbs, we see this consistent ductile top to the west and locally top southwest shear sense. This implies that the shear related to this deformation was either syn to post folding because it's not reversed on the opposite limb of the overturned folds. But here we see a nice sigmoid of dolomitic material in a marble with stair stepping showing top to the west. Here we have SCC prime fabric also showing top to the west in a metaconglomeratic lens. And here we have shear band boudinage, where one of the boudin segments has begun to rotate as a winged inclusion, also giving us a top to the west shear sense. This top to the west shear sense continues into brittle ductile conditions. So you can see this marble clast is deforming in a much more brittle fashion, accommodated by ductile deformation of the more schistose rock around it. Similarly, here we have a slightly more micaceous rock boudinaging these segments with an SCC prime type fabric. And lastly, we have this localized top to east brittle thrusting, which may explain the previous interpretations. There is top to the east thrusting, but we only see it developed in cataclasites. So we interpret this to be much later than the rest of the deformation that we see related to the folding. Okay, moving on to the upper zone, which is sort of the fleece package that sits on top of the marbles below this tectonic contact with the CBU. Pneumatics that are predominantly top east to northeast. So here we have a sort of SC type shear band with modifying this vein material, showing a top to the northeast shear sense. And down here we have a C prime type shear band that's dipping out of the page towards us, or out of the screen towards us, and giving us an overall top to the east shear sense. So this is opposite to what we see deeper into the footwall of that tectonic contact. And then these are sort of the key observations that led to some of our major conclusions. We see this relatively flat-lying foliation with abundant quartz veining that is being pulled apart. And just to spend a bit of time on this to fully flesh it out, when we see structures like this that climb the foliation and are boudinaged, these make for valid shear sense indicators because this is being stretched at the same time as it's being rotated towards the fabric attractor. And in a case where we're in a typical monoclinic shear zone, So this photo is looking parallel to the stretching lineation. So in what we would call the XZ plane, we can use this to tell us that this is giving us a top to the west-southwest shear sense. And we can confirm this using other structures that are around, like this quarter fold similarly shows top to the west-southwest shear sense. And this is all well and good. But in the pictures I showed on the slide previous to that, we are actually looking at the section that's cut perpendicular to the stretching lineation, so the Y direction, as we might want to call it. And the Y direction still shows this stretching of the quartz veins. And these are still being pulled apart in that intermediate stress axis, or the intermediate axis of strain, which we don't normally expect if we have a typical monoclinic shear zone. And we see that we have these oblique boudinage quartz veins down here that are oblique to the foliation, climbing in opposite directions. So what this tells us is that we have Y direction stretching as well as a rotation in either direction, which suggests that the overall strain ellipsoid is probably has sort of an oblate geometry when we combine the top to the northeast, probably general shear in the XY or XZ sections with the stretching we observe in the YZ sections. And this is also observed under cooler brittle ductile conditions. So these are conjugate shear bands or brittle ductile normal faults observed in the same rocks elsewhere in the tectonic window, also looking in the YZ section. And so this tells us that this Y component of stretching was probably maintained as the rocks were exhumed above the brittle ductile transition zone. So this was this style of deformation coincided with exhumation. That was a lot of information, so I'll just sum up. The lower zone, we see this two superimposed fold generations yielding a type 2 interference pattern, accompanied by dominant top to the west and top southwest shear sense that similarly lasted through ductile to brittle ductile conditions. So like with what we see in the upper zone, we can say that this probably coincided with exhumation. And that seems to be overprinted by this late top to the east brittle thrusting. In the upper zone, we have mostly subhorizontal foliations where we don't see folding as well developed or has been obscured by transposition by later strain. We have this top to the northeast shear sense with a Y direction stretching that give us an overall oblate finite strain ellipse. And when you have that degree of coaxial deformation, it might start to imply that whatever rocks you're looking at have undergone some form of ductile thinning. So just to further contextualize this, before I get to the big interpretations, we did thermodynamic modeling on a sample from the footwall, from the basal unit, that was taken from this outcrop. And what that gave us was, so it had a mineral assemblage composed of pampelite, actinolite, albite, as well as white mica and chlorite. And using our compositional isopleths, we obtain an estimate for the current mineral assemblage that records conditions of about 310 plus minus 15 degrees Celsius and 7 plus minus 1 kilobars. We see inclusions of glaucophane within the albite porphyroblasts, which suggests that the PT path that this rock followed likely passed through high pressure, low temperature conditions, and we're capturing a retrograde segment of the PT path. And so if we plot it on a PT diagram with other results from Evia, we see that as well as PT paths derived from other islands in the Cyclades, they coincide fairly well with the near peak or the near peak path for high pressure metamorphism, including this other sample that we dated that I won't talk too much about. And previous results from Evia for both the cycladic Lucius unit and the basal unit, we seem to be along either of these plausible retrograde segments of the path, suggesting we're capturing the green schist facies overprint that's common in the region. And then we did multiple single grain total fusion argon-argon dating and zircon uranium thorium helium geochronology to get a better sense of the timing of everything we were looking at. And so total fusion argon approach is you just take several grains from individual samples and you fuse them entirely. So you get a single date for multiple grains from each sample. And this loses you some of the details you would get from a step heating process, but you get a much wider view of how each sample records different age populations throughout a given tectonic unit. So as you can see, we got some fairly dispersed results. The cycladic blue schist unit records predominantly late Eocene to early Oligocene dates. That's not atypical for that unit. Most of the basal unit, by contrast, seems to record fairly old ages, some very old, up to 244 million years. So this might be a detrital signature or excess argon, but largely we want to focus on this group down here that is distributed along the contact between the upper zone metafleece unit and the basal unit, the marble belonging to the basal unit, which give a pretty uniform 25 million years age signature. And similarly, I would draw your attention to the zircon helium data, which give us a pretty uniform 16 million year age distribution for both the hanging wall cycladic blue schist unit and our 5 samples in the basal unit footwall. So all of these rocks, regardless of whether in the hanging wall or the footwall, seem to have exhumed at around the same time. And my light just went off. So these are a bit older than we'd expect for the Cyclades. Typically, we see the cycladic blue schist unit recording zircon helium cooling ages of about 9 to 13 million years ago. So this suggests that these rocks exhumed earlier than most of the rest of the Cyclades for reasons currently unknown. Just to show this on a map, I won't ask you to focus on any of these, but just to demonstrate the localization of these more uniform dates. These late Oligocene dates are concentrated along this wedge between the tectonic contact with the CBU and the underlying basal unit marble. And they give us these late Oligocene dates pretty consistently. And these are all uniform in thin section, single foliation defined by the mica, which suggests these are probably recording the timing of deformation rather than the cooling age. So to recap all of that, we have this multi-generational folding in the marbles in our lower zone that recorded top west shear sense. This might be related to subduction or exhumation, seemingly based on the progression to cooler structures. It records exhumation, but we don't have any concrete constraints on that necessarily. But by contrast, in the upper zone, we have opposite top of the northeast shear sense recorded that seems to be associated with this 25 million year deformation age occurring at green schist facies conditions. And this is associated with an oblate finite strain ellipse, suggesting that there was some sort of coaxial, mixed coaxial top of the northeast general shear occurring at this time. And this is, again, close to the timing when we expect those low angle normal faults to start taking over the bulk of the exhumation. So this is rather unsurprising. As well, the entire structural pile was exhumed by about 70 to 15 million years ago, which compares to the younger ages in the rest of the Cyclades, suggesting these have been exhumed earlier than the rest of the region. So we can accomplish exhumation by a variety of mechanisms, but we seem to be seeing mainly a combination of low angle normal faulting and ductile thinning. And the deformation associated with these seems to be maintained through exhumation above the brittle ductile transition zone at around 25 million years ago. So the deepest exhumation along a low angle normal fault is expected to occur towards the central segments of the fault. So this is a bit confusing given that we are closer to the fault tips. We're closer to the margins of the Cyclades. Although we observe greater structural levels based on metamorphism being exhumed in the central Cyclades, we do have these windows into the lower structural levels along the margins. And so to either explain this with some hitherto unrecognized structure that is upthrowing these blocks relative to the rest of the region, or we can use our observation of this oblate strain, this flattening strain, to interpret a component of ductile thinning that is contributing to the comparatively rapid exhumation of the basal unit, at least on Evia. And this has been predicted before. Dav Avigad from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem predicted that constriction he observed in the central Cyclades on Naxos, where we have a true metamorphic core complex, we have migmatites and domal uplift, should produce some sort of thinning along its margins as the material is drawn from its immediate surroundings. He did not see that. He saw that the crustal thickness in the surroundings of Naxos was maintained, and speculated that that material would have to come from further afield, closer to the margins of the Cyclades. And so this constriction might be complementary to this oblate flattening that we're seeing. Most models for the crustal configuration of the Cyclades consider each cycladic island to be its own sort of crustal scale boudin, with most of this being depicted as these sort of shear band boudins with the low angle normal faults acting as the shear bands, segmenting the different sections of the crust. But under this assumption and relating to most observations of strain near the low angle normal faults, this would imply that most of the deformation is largely non-coaxial in nature. But what we see on Evia is that there's at least a coaxial component operating in the y direction, the section perpendicular to overall transport. And so the question that is raised by our observations is that should this model be extended into 3 dimensions, and how much of that strain is being uptaken by coaxial deformation? So to answer the initial question, why do we have this disparate exposure of structural levels deeper than the CBU across the Cyclades? Well, we can't attribute it solely to differential magnitudes of exhumation, given that greatest exhumation is anticipated in the central Cyclades, and this is consistent with what we observe. But we do have this new observation of oligomycine ductile thinning, which can address some but not all of the problems. So why are these deeper naps locally exposed? Well, it might be that we're thinning the units that are above them, allowing them to exhume more rapidly than where we have constriction and relative thickening. This doesn't explain the older, seemingly older exhumation cooling ages we get from our zircon helium in the Cyclades lucis unit that would require thinning to be happening either above or throughout the package, which we don't have direct evidence for. But I think to take this further, we should go and investigate other exposures of the basal unit and look for the same strain signatures that we see on Evia. Is there this Y component of stretching exposed, say, in the Northeast Attica Peninsula, where Dave has a PhD student currently working, Christina Mikowski, or on Samos, which is on the far opposite end of the Cyclades. So to pivot a little bit and just to shamelessly plug some what I've been working on over the past year, to the south of the previous field area, we have this exposure of glaucophane-bearing veins in the cycladic blueschist unit. These veins, you can see that there's multiple sets, and they seem to have a fairly uniform, single unidirectional cross-cutting relationship to each other. You can see that there's these dense selvages of glaucophane along the margins. And these are hosted in a coarse-grained metabasaltic unit, and they terminate quite abruptly at the context of the more ductily deformed quartzite. We took mineral chemistry on the phenjite and glaucophane that are hosted in the veins. You can see some pictures of them here. They're quite nice and pristine crystals. And regardless of vein set, we get identical mineral chemistry for both the phenjite above 3.4 atoms per formula unit silica, and a consistent core to rim chemical variation in the sodic amphibole, again, independent of vein set. So that seems to tell us that these veins are all developing cogenetically at roughly the same time. Similarly, we did argon, and rubidium strontium dating of the phendrate and the glaucophane, and we obtain ages of about 23 million years, which, again, given the context of what we talked about for the rest of the talk, tells you that this is closer to the timing of extension than it is to when we would expect peak high pressure metamorphic conditions. We also did quartz phendrate oxygen isotope thermometry and obtained two temperatures that give us estimates about the same as our thermodynamic modeling from the previous section. So essentially, we see phendrate and glaucophane compositions that do not vary with different host sets, suggesting they're all cogenetic. They record this oligomycine crystallization. Well, we interpret it as crystallization because we don't see evidence for dissolution reprecipitation. They're very pristine, undeformed grains, and that significantly postdates regional peak high pressure metamorphism. And similarly, we see relatively low temperatures, 300 to 350 degrees Celsius, from isotope thermometry of the quartz and phendrate. So the takeaways here are that these don't seem to be forming at peak high pressure, low temperature conditions. In fact, based on the structural context and the geochronology, they're forming after quite a bit of exhumation has already occurred. And so this would imply that the presence of blue amphibole is being controlled more so by chemical factors than by ambient metamorphic PT conditions. And so this suggests that you can't always look at blue amphibole and conclude that you're looking at something that records subduction-related geodynamics. Additionally, there's some very nice dissolution reprecipitation textures in the host rock, which suggests that reactive transport is driving the growth of this glaucophane. This was submitted a few months ago to Contributions in Mineralogy and Petrology, so keep your eyes out on that. And I would be happy to take any questions. Thank you for listening. See if we can get lights to come back on.
Thanks, Taylor. That was great.